Let's talk today about Cisco configuration and OSPF router ID. How it's configured, why it's important to have the router ID, and let's have a look at some tips and tricks around the router ID. So let's begin. I will use this little lab with the 3 routers. OSPF is already configured. No router ID is set, so the OSPF process picked the data interface, which is the only interface in active state on those routers. The loopbacks are pre-configured, but they are in the shutdown state. So let's have a look at the router 9. If I do show IP in Brave, we can see the only interface which is up is the data interface 0/0. And if I do show IP OSPF to see the OSPF summary, I can see the router ID is 192.168.0.9. That's the IP address of the Ethernet 0/0. And this router ID was picked by the OSPF process by default, because if I look at the configuration, show run section router OSPF, there is no static configuration for the router ID. The order is the OSPF will always pick first the static configuration, then it will pick the loopback interface, and if the loopback interface is not available, then it will pick the data interface, which is our case here. The best practice is to have loopback interface configured as a router ID for the OSPF. The router ID needs to be unique. You can't have two same router IDs on the same OSPF network. The router ID is important for the OSPF database calculation for the best path algorithm. So let's go and enable the loopback and see what will happen. So I go to config mode, do int loopback 0 and do no shut. Now, theoretically, root ID should change now. If I do show IP OSPF, the router ID is the 192.168.0.9. I know lots of you will go, you need to clear the OSPF process to reset or restart the OSPF process to pick up the new router ID. So let's try that. Clear IP OSPF 1 process. You want to reset it? Yes. It will take a second. It will tear down all the OSPF neighbors. It will reestablish them. And let's have a look at the router ID now. Show IP OSPF, and the router ID is the 192.168.0.9. So why is that? To change the router ID is not enough to just reset the OSPF process. You would have to go and configure the router ID manually. The other option, how you can do it, is to restart the router completely. So if I go to configuration and I do router OSPF 1 and I do router ID and I configure the IP address of the loopback 0, you had it somewhere here, was 9.9.9.9. So I do 9.9.9.9 and click enter. It will now tell you now use the clear IP OSPF process. So let's do that. Clear IP OSPF process. I need to do it in my second window, so let me try it again. Yes. Again, it will restart the OSPF process, but now we set the router ID manually. So if I go back and do show IP OSPF, and the router ID is 9.9.9.9. Now, out of those 3 routers, the DR is the router 11. So quickly have a look at the database on the router 11. Show IP OSPF database, and we can see that the router 9 now using is this loopback as a router ID, and remaining routers 10 and 11 are still not configured with the loopback. So let's go and try to do the same on the router 10. So let's have a look. If I do show IP and brief, we can see the data interface is up. The loopback 0 is still down. Let's have a look if I've actually enabled the show IP and brief. Yeah, I enabled the loopback 0, so it's up here. Here is still down. And show run section router OSPF. Router ID is the static router ID configuration is not there. If I do show IP OSPF to see the router ID here is actually 10.10.10.net. So now that must be completely confusing. So the static configuration is not here. The data interface is 192.168.0.10 and the loopback is shut down, but the router ID is 10.10.10.10. I left it there from my previous configuration where I set it up to router ID to be 10.10.10.10. I let the interface shut down and then I reset it. So that shows that the interface doesn't even have to be up for the OSPF process, use it as a router ID. Obviously, if I go and now try to reset the OSPF clear IP OSPF process 1. It needs to be clear OSPF process. Yes. Let's see, it will reset. And I do IP OSPF. It's there. So what we can do here, we can come here and fix it back by conft and do interface loopback 0 and do no shut. Then go back to router OSPF 1 to router ID should be 10.10.10.10. And now I will exit the configuration mode and I do clear IP OSPF 1 process. Yes. Now it will reset. I do show IP OSPF. It's a 10.10.10 show IP and brief and loopback 0 is up. And if I look at the database here, show IP OSPF database, I think it will take a second for the router 10. Code 9, 11. Yeah, believe, yeah, it's coming up. So if I go back to the database, on 11, yeah, we can see now we have under the router LSA, the LSA tab 1, we have a router 9.9.9.9, 10.10.10.10, and we still have 192.168.0.11, which is the router 11 where we have not changed the router ID to the loopback 0. Now, why is it important to configure the router ID? It is easier for the troubleshooting if you know exactly which loopback belongs to the which routers and which router, and you're looking into the OSPF database. Also, the interface doesn't have to be included into the OSPF advertisement. So you don't have to enable OSPF for that interface to be the router ID. I would say it's a best practice to enable the router ID interface into the OSPF process, because quite often engineer will try and ping the router ID if he is troubleshooting the OSPF reachability. But as you see here, it doesn't have to be included. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.